where it's going to be 78 today.
right?
So
So,
I live in
poor
Austin.
fools on the East Coast.
I know, I know. I have to go to New York a lot for work, and thank God it wasn't today.
Right. Well, you probably wouldn't have been, although I guess New York didn't really get it that bad, they were
I know.
saying.
I know. I woke up
But
this morning and it was like much ado about nothing.
yeah.
So, well, great. Well, thanks for making some time for us, and we will talk for about 15 minutes or so,
Okay.
and then we'll just edit it down to the best 3 minutes, and
The prime
but,
three,
yeah.
the meat.
So you can make mistakes.
Okay.
And my producers, can you get the headphones? Can you take your headphones off?
Yes, usually they want them for these, but now we better?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
You're a little delayed now, weirdly, but
Huh. You know what's funny is that when I just started the broadcast and it's like Google Hangout is like an old RCA Victrola. It takes a little while to rev
yeah,
up.
yeah, I did
Um,
one last month and it was the same kind of thing. It was very, it seems very touchy,
yeah,
some knack to it. You don't
yeah,
want to piss it
really,
off, right?
yeah, yeah. And you can just pretend that I'm in England and have a delay without the accent. So,
Right. I'll just try not to look at you.
um, so take me back to kind of the moments when the ideas for the storied life of AJ Fikri came to you. How did the idea for the novel come to you?
Well, it's funny. I've kind of answered this question a lot, and I feel like I'm always answering it slightly differently. But essentially, you know, and I feel a little terrible saying this, the great trauma of my 20s was publishing my first novel. And ever since that happened, I guess I write books about my personal traumas to some extent. So ever since I published my first novel, I wanted to write what I would always call my book about books. So that book came out in 2005, and cut to a quick, 8 years later, and there's a book. But when I first started writing what I called the book about books, it was really about the young female writer, struggling with a marketplace that was sort of inhospitable to her. But that that isn't necessarily the greatest novel in the world. And as I would think about it over the years, eventually I decided it would be a much better story if the angle at which I came upon this trauma was the bookseller, as opposed to this very narcissistic angle of the young lady writer.
Right. And so, tell me about the kind of research. Like, did you? I mean, obviously from previous tours you had done, and your publisher, you knew booksellers. Did you have to kind of interview them about their inventory and their daily lives and how they do their business,
you know,
or did you just?
Essentially, your relationship changes quite a great deal when you become a published author versus before you were an author. So anytime I went into a bookstore prior to, say, 2005, it was only a joy. It was my favorite place to hang out. I can imagine my life through a series of bookstores. So I feel like I passed my youth in bookstores. Some people pass their youth in bars. But I was like, I'm the norm of the bookstore. I don't know. But I really didn't interview anybody except in sneaky ways. Nobody, you can kind of ask questions about publishing without, you know, when you're in publishing without letting on to the fact that you're researching a book. So I remember, sending a sneaky Facebook message to my sales rep of my books at the time and saying, like, oh, so what seasons, when do you go to pitch like the different seasons of the lists? When would you go? And asking these questions, which she just assumed probably had to do with, again, this word keeps coming up, my own narcissism for wanting to know how my own books were going to be promoted. So I feel like I was able to do sneaky research for, a decade. But no, I didn't really do any particular research, except that I will say there are a lot of booksellers that keep really great and detailed blogs, both of their reading life and their store lives. So I remember there was a great like angry blog when Borders closed that proved a wealth of information for like really untapped bookseller outrage about about things because they knew it was like the last days of Borders, you know. So these people, it was like the last days of Rome or something, you know.
Right.
You know, it's very good information, and also, you know, I would sometimes you know your books your publisher will collect those like bookseller blurbs, and then you know I would seek out the booksellers who had written blurbs for my book, and so sometimes I would kind of find myself going back to those blogs. Like I'm trying to remember his name. I can't believe it's too early, but there's a guy who runs a bookstore in I want to say like Wisconsin or somewhere, but he has a great blog, and so yes, that was basically a lot of spying and just being sneaky and the usual Googling, obsessive Googling.
Who knew that Gabrielle Zevin is a sneaky investigative reporter?
Right, who knew?
But what about that thing that we often hear that it's better for a writer not to know how the sausage is made? You know, that it's sort of easier to write your stuff and let sales reps and all the marketing people know all about the insides of publishing. Do you feel like that is true in your case, or?
Well, that sounds lovely. I love that. But I would say that the last decade, as I'm sure you know, have been kind of a time of unprecedented change for the bookselling industry. So, you know, in 2005, I had contracts that didn't even talk about ebooks, you know, that I signed for books. Like people didn't think they would factor in any way. You know, we've seen it, and it's not just that. Obviously, we've seen like a very, huge shift in the way books are sold and the way people find out about books. So I think if you were an author like me who was published for the first time in 2005, you didn't necessarily have the luxury of not learning a bit about how the sausage was made, because the sausage was constantly changing. And if you had an interest in sort of figuring out, like we've said the word sausage a lot now, if you kind of had an interest in, you know, producing optimal sausage, you had to know something about, right, the factories. And so I think that was, again, it would be great if I maybe had been Philip Roth and born when he was born and had the career he had had. I could just be like, I don't want to know, and also I retire. But you know, but being my age and when I was published for the first time, it wasn't. I don't think it was a luxury. I don't know that there are any authors that have come up in the last 10 years that are able to be quite as like out of touch, as gloriously out of touch as authors of a previous generation. You know, but I wouldn't mind being that person.
Right, totally. And so, you know, I mean, you started out as YA. We have this interesting thing happening in YA where, you know, much older readers are reading YA. Do you feel like with this latest novel that you wrote differently for an adult audience, or was it the same?
Well, actually, I didn't start out in YA. My first published novel was for adults, and so I've done. It's my third adult novel, and I don't necessarily. And I get asked this question quite a lot, and I think people want to say, well, I think there are some people that kind of want to hear that, you know, I'm using less of my brain when I'm writing for a YA audience, you know, that the work is simpler, or that kind of thing. But you know, I don't necessarily think it is, and in fact. Again, the category has emerged and changed so much in even the last 10 years that it's hard to even pinpoint what you're saying when you would, if one was to say I'm writing YA, what that means. What I know for me what that means, and I've said this all along, I didn't necessarily feel having a storyline that involves a 16 or let's say 12 to 17-year-old character isn't necessarily something that happens to me all the time. You know, I feel like that it is kind of a special happening to have a story that particularly will work with a young adult lead. And as far as I know, that is the only real characteristic of sort of a young adult novel, is that it can be many different things. Sorry, my dogs. It can be many different things, but it really has to have a young adult character at its core at this point, too, if we essentialize, if we take all the other sorts of issues away from it. So for me, you know, I know probably that I'm writing a young adult novel when, again, a young adult character seems to take center stage. And that doesn't always happen. But I don't necessarily feel the need to write, I don't necessarily feel the need either to, you know, condescend to a young adult audience or to elevate for the adult audience.
Yeah.
I was doing a panel in Boston a couple of years ago, and they asked us a similar question. And one of the people said, what is the difference between a YA novel and an adult novel? And the person said, well, a YA novel can be anything, but you have to give the YA reader hope. You got to give them hope. And as I've gotten older, I think I've realized that adult readers rather they like the hope too.
Right.
Um,
But why has it become so dark in such interesting ways? I mean, so many novels about suicide and
I think
even
it's always been dark, though.
yeah,
There've always been. I can remember reading like things that were sort of early or not quite YA novels, like Go Ask Alice, or some of. I remember one book, and obviously Go Ask Alice is a ridiculous book, but but you always read YA because you were, when you read YA, even in the early 90s or the late 80s or the whatever, the mid 80s even, because you thought you were going to get something dark. I don't know that you ever read it because you wanted,
hope.
yes, hope. Like I read so many things that had, like eating disorders or, a good amount of sex crime of various stripes, that was in YA, before I even really knew what YA was, other than two letters on the side of a book at the library.
Yeah, yeah, and that's interesting that the Wall Street Journal article that kind of started this whole thing maybe like a few years ago, or yeah, maybe like 2 years ago, where a mother and a
Mm.
critic said, it needs to be less dark. But you're right, like it has been dark for a long time.
It's
Um,
always been dark, and I think to an extent it just reflects, and again, to make a broad generalization about teenagers, which is always kind of the ridiculous thing when we act as if teenagers are just one thing that have one set of feelings and one set of needs, this kind of thing. But yeah, I feel like YA has always been dark because teenage life feels dark,
mhm,
to an extent.
yeah,
But yes, I mean, obviously the rise of like particularly maybe dystopia or what have you has been, you know, more extraordinary than just sort of the issues novel, the darkness of the just kind of the issues novel that we saw before, that kind of thing. But
yeah, for sure. And so, I mean, this book has done particularly well for you. Why? What do you think it is about it that is resonating so well with readers?
um, you know, I'm kind of like two minds when I answer that question, and the one is that you kind of never. Something that I've learned is that my experience of writing a book has relatively little to do with the reader's experience of reading a book. If I knew what was going to like turn readers on, I would kind of have a hit every time, and that's not what happens. And so there's to some extent, I really just put my head down and work whenever I'm writing anything. But I think that when I write books about what I'm thinking about at the time, about questions I want to answer. When those questions overlap with questions that other people also seem to be having en masse, for instance, like, why do bookstores matter? This kind of thing. Then I think it's more likely to be popular because maybe that's what the zeitgeist is. To do the ugly thing of speculating about one's own success. you know but I do think that when my interests, and they don't always overlap with people's interests in general, then my books have tended to do better. When I'm thinking about something that other people don't want to be thinking about at all, or just aren't thinking about, then those books have done less well.
Yeah. Well, would you say that most of your ideas and sort of novels have come to you in the form of that kind of zeitgeist kind of question, like why do bookstores matter, or is it more prevalent that a certain character is speaking to you and you want to follow that person and describe their life?
I think it's always both. It's always, and I kind of tried to describe this in an essay once. The essay was, the question was something like, where do ideas come from? And for me, it's never one idea. There have to be so many, like a cluster of ideas, almost like a cancer-like cluster of ideas for me to want to work on anything. So yes, I think it's both. There's a character that it compels me in some way, but there's a question that I want to answer in a larger way. And sometimes when I'm starting, I'm not even sure what that question is. And I sometimes feel like when people are talking about the creative process that they have a tendency to simplify it to turn it into answer. you know but for me, writing a book, I've written books many different kinds of ways at this point, to where I know that there isn't one process, and I understand that. I think people ask the question because they want to know, can I do this, how do I do this, but from my point of view, it's lots of different sorts of things that make a book, that come into a book, so it really is both.
Yeah, yeah. And so, what are you still doing events for this novel?
I am. I traveled about 180 days last year, which is a lot. Yeah, it's a lot. And this year they were like, well, we really think you should go on another like little tour, like a paperback tour. But it looks like it's kind of 3 weeks ish, which seems sort of long to me, as I'm looking at it. But but yes, so I'm going on book tour again in about, like, I think 2 weeks now, and some of it's going to be snowy, I think. So there's a chance I'm not going to show up to
Yeah,
some places. So, you know,
yeah. You should just do the Southwest and the South.
there's some Southwest, but there's also some like upstate New York and Utah.
Right.
So I think those are like 50-50 kinds of things. But there is some Southwest and South, which is good. I wish it was kind of all that.
Right, right. And so, what is your next project? Can you talk about it yet?
I can, but it's so funny. I find that the more I talk about something I'm working on, the more I start to acquire a huge distaste for it. you know, that
Uh,
just somehow the act of like starting to synopsize a book, and it just makes me start to hate it a little bit before I'm even done with it. And then there's the flip side of that is I remember when my first book came out, you did all those like little first novel interviews and stuff, and every interview I gave, I would talk about this vaudeville book I was working on, and here we're 10 years later, and the vaudeville book has never shown up for my readers. So this is kind of a thing, that the more I talk about something, the more I'm likely to just want to quit it and throw it in the drawer. And I
so
think it
we'll,
actually speaks to sort of some of the things with just being online in general. Like, there are a lot of authors that do very well about talking about work in process, but I don't find that I'm one of those. I feel like it's like the anthropologists, with when they go into civilization, it changes the work itself to speak of it. you know so I'm always happy to speak when I'm done, but the short answer is yes, I'm working on a book, and it's evolving.
yeah, nice. Well, we will leave it at that and not make you talk about it anymore.
I talked
Hold on
around
to
it.
it.
Yeah.
You did. You actually did a very good job of talking around it. So, um, but thanks for making some time for us early morning LA.
Yes.
And congrats on the success of this one, and hope the next one does just as well.
Yeah, me too. Thanks very much.
Okay, have a good day.
You too.
Okay, bye bye.